Good morning. Today
Good
is April 12th,
morning.
and we will be speaking with Senator Richard Black. Senator Richard Black, what do you have for us today?
Well, we're going to do a very interesting topic. And our topic today is what is DEI and why is it so reviled? This we're in the midst of a really major cultural revolution surrounding the whole issue of equal rights. Um, the the Civil Rights Act 1964 was passed at a time when we were just coming out of segregation, and still some parts of the change in culture and policy were unfolding, and the what happened is the idea was that there was supposed to be equality under law. You had people who had, the blacks particularly, who had been um, segregated and their opportunities limited in many ways. And uh, under President Lyndon Johnson, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was enacted. It was quite a monumental landmark law, and uh, so in the midst of this idea of DEI. DEI is a relatively new concept. It's something that sort of evolved over the last 10 years. And DEI is diversity, equity, inclusion. it, it differs very dramatically from the idea of equal opportunity. Equal opportunity meant um, that somebody who is black, somebody who's Hispanic, somebody who's Asian, somebody who's white would all be treated in an equal and fair way. They could apply for jobs, and whoever was the best qualified would be hired. And somewhere along the way, early along the way, things got badly distorted, and it sort of came to a head with the DEI movement. DEI sort of arose out of the George Floyd civil unrest, the riots, the looting, the burning, and so forth. And it sort of tipped companies into uh, into a very extreme state on issues of race and sex and so forth. Um, from the almost from the outset of the Civil Rights Act 1964, the act was misapplied. What the act says is that there will be no discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in quite a number of programs. And literally from the very beginning, the idea sort of became entrenched that, well, what we're really focused on is certain certain races, and then later on certain sexes, and then certain national origins. But that's not what the Civil Rights Act of 1964 says. It says that, everyone is entitled to equal protection, and everyone has a race, has a sex, has a color, has a national origin. Um, there was an unspoken presumption, and it was strong, it was powerful, and it was pervasive, and it was that only certain races counted. It was that only only one sex. Originally, this was the female sex. Only the female sex was entitled to protection. Um, and the presumption was that national origin meant foreigners, or not foreigners, but people who emigrated here and then were naturalized citizens. But that's not what the act said. It said that every person, regardless of their race, regardless of their sex, regardless of their color, regardless of their national origin, had protection. And what is happening now under the Trump administration is a literal application of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to recognize that race includes people of lighter skin, whites, Asians. Um, it includes males and females, although they've made it quite clear that there are only males and females in this world. There's not Heinz 57 varieties of all kinds of crazy, crazy things that were recently hatched up. And everyone has a national origin, which means that native born Americans cannot be discriminated against. Now, that seems obvious, but it has not been, and that is not how the Department of Justice has applied the rules. It's not how the Department of Education has applied the rules, or the Health and Human Services. The entire federal government, and then by extension, uh, virtually all of the state governments have imposed a discriminatory structure on all of the rules and practices that govern us. Now, I had an interesting experience when I was a brand new attorney just out of law school, and the lawyer who was supervising me had a client that came in, and she was alleging sex discrimination. She worked for the Air Force, and so I was given her case to prepare a complaint and to file that, which I did. So, in very short order, I ended up, and by the way, it's very complex law, and I was starting from ground zero, so I didn't know what I was doing, but I learned a great deal in the process. I went to Pensacola, Florida, and made an appearance before Judge Winston E. Arno, who was sort of the plenipotentiary of northern Florida. He really ruled. He had immense power over what occurred in this part of the state. And so we went into his chambers, and when the judge came in, I rose, and across from me, here I am, I'm a kid about 2 weeks out of law school, and on the other side of the table are six highly experienced Air Force JAG attorneys, some of them with a couple of decades of experience. And so we all rose when the judge came in. He sat down, we sat down. And then the judge picked up the complaint that I had prepared, and he began to read it, and he misread it. The case was captioned Joan Holland versus United States. He misread it, and he thought it said John Holland. And he leaned way back in his chair. He set down the complaint, and he sort of mused as though he was speculating on something in the stars. And he said, I suppose that it's theoretically possible that a male could allege sex discrimination under the act. Well, I I said, Your Honor, I said the case is Joan Holland, female, and he glanced down. He saw it was Joan Holland. Immediately, he sat up. He moved up to the table. He took the complaint. He grabbed a pen and he began going through it in detail. So he had not taken that case seriously at all. He was just having a little fun before he dismissed the case and said it was all silly. But as soon as he saw that it was Joan, it was a woman, then it was the real deal. And I think what happened in that particular hearing was typical of what was happening across the nation. There was an understanding within the organized bar, and it ran from the Supreme Court down to little villages and towns across America. The idea was that it didn't matter what the Civil Rights Act of 1964 said, you were going to apply it by providing preferences to certain racial groups, sex groups, and so forth. So this is what was going on. There was an interesting case that got quite a bit of publicity, and I think it started off in 1988, and then was decided maybe 10 years later. It was two Malone brothers versus the Civil Service Commission. And what happened is you had two brothers they were white, male, fair skinned, and they wanted to join the fire department. And the fire department was inclined to hire black. They wanted black firemen. And so the two white brothers, the Malone brothers, put down on their application they were black. Apparently, they actually had some foundation for that, because within their family there was an old sepia tone photograph of one of their grandmothers that she could have been black, but the photography back then wasn't very accurate in recording those things. Well, in any event, the two white brothers got hired, and they did very well. Their performance ratings were sterling. Everyone was happy. And then 10 years after they went to work, someone surfaced the idea that these two light-haired guys, they don't look black. And the next thing, they were fired for claiming they were black and not really being black. And so this case went on appeal. Eventually, I think, as I recall, the two brothers were their termination was upheld. And it caused quite a stir, because it sort of put the idea in people's faces that, yeah, this whole thing is really a big charade. Here you can fire people because they're not black. It just sort of made a farce of the whole idea of equal protection under the law. Well, brings us current with DEI. DEI in recent years, since the George Floyd uprising, it shifted from the idea of what's happening to individuals. Is this individual being discriminated against or not? And there was some very radical black work done that sort of came up with this notion that it was a very communistic notion, the idea that groups had to be equal. In other words, if you had, let's say you went through your nuclear scientists and you found that of your nuclear scientists, uh, almost all of them were white, or all of them were white or Asian. And you didn't have a Hispanic, you didn't have black nuclear scientists. You had to change this. This was discriminatory, and you had to have an equal portion of blacks, an equal portion of Hispanics. And of course, that's not the way the world works. Human beings are not completely homogeneous. Um, uh, Interestingly, this was never applied in the sports arena. They never said, well, we got too many black basketball players. We can't have that. We have to have equal numbers of Hispanics, equal number of whites. Nobody ever tried to do that, but particularly in the employment context, in the educational arena, we did attempt to do that. And after George Floyd, with all the violence that occurred, the arson, the looting, the murders of dozens of police and so forth, there was just this overwhelming surrender of the culture to say, okay, we're going to adopt this DEI. Now, this infiltrated our public schools, and critical race theory and DEI were integrated into the teachings from kindergarten up to high school, and and what you would have is you might have a second grade class, and the teacher would say, okay, now we're in some of these classes they'd actually have labels put on certain children and said, okay, Karen, you're white, and so you're an oppressor, and Jane, you're black, so you're oppressed, and you over here, you're oppressed, and you're an oppressor. Uh, you have a Korean background, don't you? Well, you're an oppressor. Um, and you would literally have teachers who would separate the children, and then they would talk back and forth at one another about how oppressed this one was, how this one was privileged and had advantages. The little children, they didn't even understand. What are you talking about? What is this? I recall very, very vividly a news clip that came out during these very violent riots during the George Floyd uprising, and there was a young white girl, uh, could have been 18, 20 years old, and the mob chased her through the streets, and and she was finally cornered, and she was forced to kneel down on the sidewalk, and she was ordered to confess to her white privilege, and she had very good reason to feel that she was about to be killed, and so she confessed, yes, I have white privilege. And then the individual who was in charge said, all right, now tell us what your white privilege is. And this poor girl was totally flummoxed. She couldn't think of any privilege that she had. She was just a young girl, just trying to live her life, not hurting anybody in the world. And, she's just an ordinary kid. She didn't have privileges like most people. Most people aren't privileged. Now, okay, I'll grant you there are people who attend Harvard and Yale who are privileged. There are people uh, who are the children of billionaires who are privileged, but not many of us are children of billionaires. Lots of us came from broken families. Lots of us had nobody to look after us when we were kids. Lots of us had no money, we didn't have allowance, we didn't have that kind of thing. We packed our own lunch because nobody else was going to feed us lunch if we didn't feed ourselves. So we took a bag lunch, like I did throughout all of the early years while I was in school. Other people had them, yes. Other people could buy their lunches, but I never bought my lunch until you know I was in high school somewhere. Um, so it was it was a very hideous thing. This idea of setting people in schools against one another as privileged and unprivileged and oppressors and oppressed. It was a very communist idea. This idea that there would be class warfare, and that the proletariat would rise up against the bourgeois and eventually kill all the bourgeois, as they did in the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. It's one of the most hideous events in all human history. And here we were adopting that same structure based on race in this country. And I think, in part, the election of Donald Trump uh, really was a backlash against this. Now, um, there there are some very interesting things that are going on. Has one of the things that has caused a major shift is a case that was decided several years ago called Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard. And Students for Fair Admissions sued Harvard, and there was a companion case out of North Carolina, I believe. And the Supreme Court handed down a ruling, and it said essentially that you could not use racial preferences in evaluating students for admission to Harvard and to the other school in North Carolina. And the bottom line is that the focus of equal protection under the Constitution and under the Civil Rights Act is on individuals. It's not on groups. Now, that case percolated for a number of years, and it gradually has just sort of really come to fruition under the Trump administration, which is very aggressively enforcing it. There is another Supreme Court case that has already been heard. There'll be a decision by this summer, and it's called Ames versus the Ohio Department of Youth Services. It's a case involving Ames, who I believe is white, and she alleged that her employer discriminated by favoring a minority group in her workplace. And so she was filing suit under the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And she is in the Sixth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals within their district. And in the course of her case going forward, it turns out that in the Sixth Circuit, you are required to have a higher standard for your pleadings if you're white than if you are a minority. In other words, you're held to a higher standard. If you're minority, you can reach it this way. If you're white, if you're Asian, you have a higher burden. And this case has been heard by the U.S. Supreme Court. based on the questions asked by the justices and the Chief Justice, it seems very likely that her case will be considered, and they will rule in her favor. That there is nothing in the law or the Constitution that allows the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, of all places, to discriminate against her based on race. So when that case is decided, I think it's going to give sort of an extra boost to equal rights under the law, and this will give even a stronger push towards restoring genuine civil rights to all Americans, regardless of race, sex, national origin. Now, just to touch on one thing, President Trump has issued several executive orders touching on the issue of DEI. DEI is being scrubbed from every place in the nation. You no more want to proclaim your adherence to DEI than you want to claim to be a member of the Ku Klux Klan. It has become the same sort of thing. DEI is analogous to discrimination, and so it's being wiped out everywhere. One of Trump's executive orders says that federal contractors must not operate programs promoting DEI, and that they are required to certify that when they submit contracts or when they submit grants, they have to certify that they are not promoting DEI and that they're not violating applicable federal anti-discrimination laws. This becomes an immensely powerful tool because when you submit a federal contract or grant, you come under the False Claims Act. And the False Claims Act says that anyone who submits a claim to the federal government and knowingly makes a statement that is a material false or fraudulent claim is liable for triple damages, plus penalties and cost. And so if a contractor is subtly under the surface continuing to discriminate, then they open themselves up to potentially bankrupting liability. And what makes this even more powerful is that the claims, there's a provision that allows these violations to be prosecuted by private parties who sue on behalf of the government. And you can imagine you're going to have people who work at a company, and that company all of a sudden is, subtly discriminating under the surface, giving preference to this group or to that group, and the individual who's experiencing or seeing it can go down and hire a lawyer, and the next thing they sue, and the person who wins the lawsuit can get as much as 25 or 30% of the proceeds from the whole action. So it's a tremendous financial incentive, and it really puts a target on contractors with the government to, if they have anything to do with DEI or racial discrimination or sex discrimination, they really need to be very careful. Um, it's interesting. Some years ago, I had a wonderful lady who had worked with me. Geneva Good was her name. She's passed away some years ago. Uh, she owned a small concrete company, family owned, small business. I don't know how many employees, could have been 50. And at a certain point, she could not win contracts. Most of her most of her business was with the government. She would do small contracts for them, and so for the first time in her lifetime, it looked like they might go under. The company might go under, and she didn't understand it. So one day she told me, she said, uh, she said, I went to lunch with my girlfriend who was also in the concrete business. And I talked with her and I said, she said, I just can't get work. I can't win bids. I don't know what's happening. And so her girlfriend said, well, Geneva, are you hiring Americans? And she said, well, of course, I hire Americans and, hire black, hire white. And, uh, and the woman said, no, she said, you're not following what I'm saying. She said, unless you bring in illegal aliens, you cannot compete. If you're hiring Americans, they're just too expensive. You've got to buy all of this insurance for them. If they get injured, all of these other costs, and you got to pay minimum wage and unemployment and all this stuff. You can't compete like that. She said, you got to be honest. She said, this is what the government's requiring, is that uh, you, you know, the government is allowing the illegal aliens to come in, and if you don't hire them, then you can't compete. And so Geneva had been forced into beginning to bring on illegal aliens, and naturally, then Americans couldn't compete. They just couldn't compete because they're having to deal with people who didn't have to be insured. They didn't have to have minimum wage. They didn't have all of those things. So the the effects of the type of discrimination we've been under for so long are immense. They are far-reaching, and uh, I think they're coming to an end. I never thought in my entire lifetime I would see this, but I think we're likely to see the time when people are dealt with as people and not as racial groups, sex groups, national origin groups. So, whatever someone thinks, whether they think this is positive or negative, it's important to understand it because it is a very, very powerful thing, and it's going to affect everyone's lives starting right now.
Thank you, Senator. That was a very, very important segment. I feel like that kind of brings us together in the understanding of what's really going on here with the conflict against DEI. I know that a lot of the narrative that's driven is basically on the left leaning shows. It's more of it's negative. It's a regression in our progress, and I would say even sometimes the right leaning mainstream media takes it and it doesn't eloquently put the case like you presented, where it's not done out of malice or um, the direct attacking or belittling of the white class, but it's a lot more nuanced, and you provided a really good case of why we should understand what's really happening. And with that, I believe we are done for the day. I wanted to thank Senator and all those that are listening. Next week, join us and we will talk more about what's going on and focus on the news. Have a good one.
Thank you.